Good morning. So today's lectionary features sex and food and power and privilege and betrayal. And the main characters are, of course, King David and Jesus. And the supporting cast is Uriah, the unsuspecting loyal husband and soldier, Bathsheba, the beautiful and now pregnant by David wife, and a young boy who had his lunch taken away from him. So it's more of a soap opera than a sermon today. I think it's more insulting at times than inspiring, and it's definitely more confusing to me than comforting. So where are we going to begin? I want to start with David and Jesus. You may have noticed at the beginning of the Old Testament reading that David stayed home at the customary time of year for kings to go to battle. And just a few chapters back, David and God had a very intense conversation that ended with God strongly affirming David's call and role as a warrior and leader of the Israelite army. And now, here he is, staying back, not engaging. Something is off. To me, it sounds like David was tired, maybe a little depressed. And then one afternoon, he's lying on the couch and he sees this beautiful woman bathing, and he did not look away. He saw her, he wanted her, and he used his power and his position to sleep with her that very afternoon. And of course, she gets pregnant, and he realizes, I have to do something to avoid my friend Uriah, her husband, finding out what's happened. So he desperately tries to cover up the misdeed, summoning Uriah, the warrior who had actually gone to the battlefield, unlike David. And David tries everything he can think of to get Uriah to sleep with his own wife, so that David can pass the baby off as Uriah's. But Uriah, intent on serving David well and being loyal to all, refuses. Now, this frantic attempt by David completely, by the way, disregards the woman. If his plan had worked, she would be carrying his child, passing it off as her husband's, living the rest of her life down the street from David, intimidated, I think, covering up what happened. We don't know if David raped her or if she slept with him willingly. But one thing is very clear. David initiated this. He took advantage of the extreme power dynamic, sought to cover it up, leaving her to figure out the rest of her life, her marriage, and this child. Now, of course, his plan doesn't work because of Uriah's loyalty, so David writes this letter to the commander of the army, basically telling him to get Uriah killed in battle. And in what I think is a cruel twist, he hands this letter to the commander, to Uriah, to deliver. Heartless and manipulative. This is clearly a story of power and position going bad. Now, Jesus. Jesus is also a popular leader. In today's gospel, we read that screaming crowds were literally pursuing him through the countryside. He had the stature and the reputation and the charisma of a celebrity. So we have one King David hiding from his work, isolating and out of touch with the people he's called to be with, and Jesus immersed in the throngs of hungry, hurting people. Now notice Jesus too was tired and actually tried to get away from the crowd for a prayer time. Good and healthy habit. However, the people relentlessly pursued him up the mountain into the wilderness. And towards the end of the day, even though Jesus' first thought was, I'm tired and I need quiet, he looks at the people and is moved by compassion, sensing their hunger, and an idea from God rises up within him. When David was tired, he disengaged. He isolated himself from the people and their needs. He gave in to his own hunger, his surge of lust, feeding his pangs at the expense of others, contrasting Jesus, who when he was tired went into the wilderness but connected with the compassion he felt when he encountered need and hunger in others, and Jesus engaged with his community to meet that need. It's made me think this week, when I am tired, when I've had enough of ministry, which does happen, when we've had enough, which way do we tend to go? You know, Jesus even asks his disciples, even though Jesus already knows the answer, and the gospel underlines this for us, he engages his disciples asking them, how would you feed this crowd? And they know it's going to take 6 months' wages to buy enough food, and we don't have that. But Jesus engages them all the same and then focuses in on what they do have. A kid's lunchbox of 5 rolls and 2 small fish and the presence of God, and Jesus gets to work. Jesus gives thanks to God. He breaks the bread and gives it to all, a precursor of the Eucharist we are about to celebrate. And of course, this bread more than meets the needs of the thousands and thousands of people there. It's miraculous. In the hands of Jesus, the not enough that everyone was feeling becomes more than enough. And the hungry are satisfied. And the hero of the day is a young boy who handed over his lunch, and imagine how he got to brag to his friends. Right? This is the opposite of the mentality that David expresses. David experiences need which is legitimate. David looks for what others have, in this case Uriah, his friend, and he takes it to feed himself with no regard for the rights, hungers of others. David leaves nothing for other people, unlike Jesus and the disciples. And David even takes what his friends do have left, their life, to ensure he doesn't get into trouble. It's quite a contrast. Most of us, I hope and pray, will not end up in the extremes that David did. But all of us, I believe, know what it's like to be on that slippery slope that David slid down. Let's take a moment to examine the lessons David and Jesus give us today. David's troubles started when he disengaged and isolated from the work and the community God gave him to do. And it's easy to do that. I'm speaking for myself when we get tired or down. But if we stay there and dwell in that place, it can lead us to choices and actions that damage ourselves and one another. Jesus, when he was tired, sought connection with God and refreshment through spiritual practice, and stayed connected to his community and the work God gave him. Jesus was alive and aware of rising compassion in himself, and he was willing to engage it. Jesus didn't have to involve his disciples in the miracle the way he did. He probably didn't even need the bread and the fish. But Jesus shows us the importance of connection and community and engaging with others when we face challenges and when we are tired. David's path to murder started with very small choices. To stay home, to look at a woman, to not look away from that woman, to call her, to sit with her and linger, to touch, and ultimately sleep with. I work with enough people in the jail who have found themselves on the end of serious charges leading to decades in prison. And without fail, they all talk about the small steps and choices that took them to that moment. What do you have in place in your life to help us know when the steps that we are taking us places we do not want to go? And if you're listening to this right now and you are taking steps to places you do not want to go, reach out for help. Talk to someone and turn around before you find yourself in that place. Finally, when David didn't have what he wanted, when David felt he didn't have enough, and let's note, but by the time we get to this story in Scripture, David already has 2 wives of his own. But apparently he felt hungry for something, and he took it and he hoarded it all for himself, not trusting in what God had already given him, not trusting that God would provide in the future. Contrasting, Jesus faced need around him, and Jesus did not give up because what he seemed to have available seemed like not enough. Jesus moved. He took what God had given him, even if it felt insufficient. He gave thanks and broke it. And he just started handing it out into hungry hand after hungry hand. He fed the hungry one mouth at a time and let God do the miracle bit. When we face lack, when we're hungry for something, when we feel like we don't have enough, will we grab and hoard like David, or will we open our hands like Jesus? Let's not let our times of not enough be the end of our story. But let's give away what we do have, moment by moment, and let God do the rest. To end today, I want to turn back to the 2 less prominent characters in our story, Bathsheba and the boy. Jesus and David give us a lot to think about as we manage our power and positions of privilege. Bathsheba and the boy give us stories of people who were engaged by power and how that plays out. And I just wonder how the story would sound different if they were written from their point of view. For Bathsheba, I wonder, what were the effects of David's actions on her? I wonder how his invitation to sleep with her affected how she saw herself and her life. And when she became pregnant and he didn't offer to help but sought to kill her husband, where does that leave her and her unborn child? The rest of the story unfolds in the next chapters of Samuel. But maybe you have been Bathsheba at some point in your life. Used, abused. God sees you and what has happened. Maybe all of us can spend time with her story to enter into compassion for the many, many, many people in our society who do now, today, feel used, unseen, overlooked and abused by power and position. The young boy, to end with, well, Jesus did take his lunch. And if I were his mother, I'd be scolding Jesus at this point. But that food was taken with gratitude, broken, and immediately given back to those in need, including the boy, multiplied miraculously. And I like to think that Jesus gave the first helping to the little boy who was watching, who then got to follow him around and see his tiny lunch, his not enough, turn into something that satisfied thousands. Now that is what it does look like to be engaged by the power of God. There is a letting go of your little lunch, but there's also a feeding of many. There is a breaking, and there's also a gratitude. And there is doubt. Will this work? And there is amazement as we see God work in ways we never imagined. So with this crazy lectionary today, as we turn in a few minutes towards the bread that feeds us in more ways than we understand and can imagine, I invite you to let these stories sit with you this week, swirl around you, and ask God to speak deeply through them to our hearts. Amen.